Disorders of intellectual development. Disorders of intellectual development is grouped with neurodevelopmental disorders along with developmental speech or language disorders, developmental speech sound disorder, developmental speech fluency disorder, developmental language disorder, autism spectrum disorder, developmental learning disorder, developmental motor coordination disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, stereotyped movement disorder, other specified neurodevelopmental disorders. In addition, 3 categories from the grouping of primary tics and tic disorders in the chapter on diseases of the nervous system, Chapter 8, are cross-listed here, including Tourette syndrome, chronic motor tic disorder, chronic phonic tic disorder. Neurodevelopmental disorders are those that involve significant difficulties in the acquisition and execution of specific intellectual, motor, language or social functions with onset during the developmental period. Disorders of intellectual development. In International Classification of Diseases 11th revision, mental retardation is renamed as disorders of intellectual development. This carries less stigma and adequately capture the range of forms and etiologies associated with this condition. Essential features of disorders of intellectual development. 1. The presence of significant limitations in intellectual functioning across various domains such as perceptual reasoning, working memory, processing speed, and verbal comprehension. There is often substantial variability in the extent to which any of these domains are affected in an individual. Whenever possible, performance should be measured using appropriately normed, standardized tests of intellectual functioning, and found to be approximately 2 or more standard deviations below the mean, i.e., approximately less than the 2.3 RD percentile. In situations where appropriately normed and standardized tests are not available, assessment of intellectual functioning requires greater reliance on clinical judgment based on appropriate evidence and assessment, which may include the use of behavioral indicators of intellectual functioning. 2. The presence of significant limitations in adaptive behavior, which refers to the set of conceptual, social, and practical skills that have been learned and are performed by people in their everyday lives. Conceptual skills are those that involve the application of knowledge, for example, reading, writing, calculating, solving problems, and making decisions, and communication. Social skills include managing interpersonal interactions and relationships, social responsibility, following rules and obeying laws, as well as avoiding victimization, and practical skills are involved in areas such as self-care, health and safety, occupational skills, recreation, use of money, mobility and transportation, as well as use of home appliances and technological devices. Expectations of adaptive functioning may change in response to environmental demands that change with age. Whenever possible, performance should be measured with appropriately normed, standardized tests of adaptive behavior and the total score found to be approximately 2 or more standard deviations below the mean, i.e., approximately less than the 2.3 RD percentile. In situations where appropriately normed and standardized tests are not available, assessment of adaptive behavior functioning requires greater reliance on clinical judgment based on appropriate assessment, which may include the use of behavioral indicators of adaptive behavior skills. 3. Onset occurs during the developmental period. Among adults with disorders of intellectual development who come to clinical attention without a previous diagnosis, it is possible to establish developmental onset through the person's history, i.e., retrospective diagnosis. Additional clinical features. 1. Problem or challenging behaviors such as aggression, self-injurious behavior, attention-seeking behavior, oppositional defiant behavior, and sexually inappropriate behavior are more frequent among those with disorders of intellectual development than in the general population. 2. Many individuals with disorders of intellectual development are more gullible and naive, easier to deceive, and more prone to acquiescence and confabulation than people in the general population. This can lead to various consequences including greater likelihood of victimization, becoming involved in criminal activities, and providing inaccurate statements to law enforcement. 3. Significant life changes and traumatic experiences can be particularly difficult for a person with disorders of intellectual development. 4. Whereas the timing and type of life transitions vary across societies, it is generally the case that individuals with disorders of intellectual development need additional support adapting to changes in routine, structure, or educational or living arrangements. 5. There are many medical conditions that can cause disorders of intellectual development and that are, in turn, associated with specific additional medical problems. A variety of prenatal, for example, exposure to toxic substances or harmful medications, perinatal, for example, labor and delivery problems, and postnatal, for example, infectious encephalopathies, factors may contribute to the development of disorders of intellectual development, and multiple etiologies may interact. Early diagnosis of the etiology of a disorder of intellectual development, when possible, can assist in the prevention and management of related medical problems. For example, frequent thyroid disease screening is recommended for individuals with Down syndrome. If the etiology of a disorder of intellectual development in a particular individual has been established, the diagnosis corresponding to that etiology should also be assigned. 6. Individuals with disorders of intellectual development are at greater risk for a variety of health, for example, epilepsy, and social, for example, poverty, problems across the lifespan. Boundary with normality. 1. In disorders of intellectual development, a measure of intelligence quotient, IQ, is not an isolated diagnostic requirement to distinguish disorder from normality, but should be considered a proxy measure of the significant limitations in intellectual functioning that partially characterize disorders of intellectual development. The diagnosis of disorders of intellectual development should not be made solely based on IQ scores but must also include a comprehensive evaluation of adaptive behavior. It is quite possible that during the developmental period, a child may meet the diagnostic requirements of disorders of intellectual development on one occasion but not another. Multiple testing on different occasions during the developmental trajectory is necessary to establish a reliable estimate of functioning. 2. What is sometimes termed borderline intellectual functioning, defined as intellectual functioning between approximately 1 and 2 standard deviations below the mean, is not a diagnosable disorder. Nonetheless, such individuals may present many needs for supports and interventions that are similar to those of persons with disorders of intellectual development. Developmental presentations: 1. There is wide variability in the developmental presentation of individuals with disorders of intellectual development. Behavioral indicators and behavioral indicators of adaptive behavior provide clinicians with some of the key areas of strengths and weaknesses typically observed at different time points across development, i.e., early childhood, adolescence, and adulthood, in individuals with disorders of intellectual development. 2. Conditions related to disorders of intellectual development may be suspected during the first days and months of life due to the presence of certain physical signs such as facial dimorphisms, congenital malformation, micro or macrocephalia, low weight, hypertonia, growth retardation, and failure to thrive, among others. 3. In older children, disorders of intellectual development may manifest as problems in acquiring academic knowledge and abilities such as reading, writing, arithmetic, etc. 4. The manifestations of disorders of intellectual development during late adolescence and the first years of adulthood may be strongly influenced by the presence of challenges related to assuming adult roles, such as post-secondary education, employment, independent living, and adult relationships. 5. Older adults with disorders of intellectual development may present with a more rapid onset of dementia or declining skills than older adults in the general population. They also have significantly more difficulty gaining access to necessary supports and appropriate health care for medical problems. Sex and/or gender-related features. 1. The overall prevalence is slightly higher in males. The prevalence of some etiologies of disorders of intellectual development differs between males and females. For example, X-linked genetic conditions such as Fragile X syndrome are predominantly diagnosed in males, whereas Turner syndrome occurs exclusively in females. 2. Males are more likely to exhibit hyperactivity and conduct disturbances, whereas females are more likely to exhibit mood and anxiety symptoms. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe.